Easter's ultimate mystery. Virtually all scholars agree that Jesus of Nazareth lived in the first century, preached about the kingdom of God, and was crucified. But what happened next is the most controversial issue of history. Did Jesus rise from the dead and thus authenticate his claim to being the Son of God? Or is this the stuff of legend and mythology? Joining me is Tim Callahan, religion editor of Skeptic Magazine and author of Secret Origins of the Bible. And Dr. Gary Habermas, who's considered one of the world's leading authorities on the resurrection. He chairs the Philosophy and Theology department at Liberty University, has written several books on the resurrection, his most recent being The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Well, Tim, let me start with you. In your book, you suggest that the resurrection of Jesus isn't original at all, but it's merely a story that was recycled from earlier mythology and mystery religions. You specifically in your book mentioned the stories of Osiris, Adonis, and Attis. Could you explain what all this means?
Well, the resurrection is, again, there were death and resurrection stories going all the way back, as you said, to Isis and Osiris, and usually in Dionysus, out of Greek mythology, he had his own separate cult, and in all of these, they die an excruciating death of some sort. Dionysus is torn to pieces and eaten by the Titans. And then they rise physically from the dead.
So you're saying that this Jesus story then is just a recapitulation of this earlier mythology?
Well, not necessarily exactly a recapitulation, but I think that basically the evidence for it is lacking. Okay.
Dr. Habermas, what's your response to that?
Let's take Adonis. Adonis is probably the ancient god for which we have the clearest data that he was raised from the dead. We have 4 accounts that Adonis was raised. The earliest one is the 2nd century A.D. The other ones are between the 2nd and 4th century A.D. The earliest account we have for Attis is the 3rd century A.D. And while Isis and Osiris, as a religion, was definitely pre-Christian, there is no resurrection in Isis and Osiris. Osiris in particular is not raised.
Okay, Tim, how do you respond to that?
I would point out that oftentimes the only copies of the myths we have are quite late as far as writings go, but quite often we have some evidence of the myths in the form of pictures on vases of the various mythic characters and the situations of the myths. So we can be pretty sure that they were being told orally a lot earlier.
Go ahead, Dr. Habermas.
If we're talking about stories on vases or on other reliefs, there is still no resurrection. There are no resurrected gods for which we have influence, for which we have data prior to the 2nd century.
Is this an objection, Gary, that you get a lot from scholars, that this is the origin of the resurrection of Jesus is somehow based on or influenced by these earlier mythologies?
Well, I've done a count recently of 1,200 sources on the resurrection, everything published since 1975 in German, French, and English. And I went back and I looked how many of these scholars who hold university chairs, for example, how many of them who are not Christians, who do not hold to the resurrection, how many of them would say that in any way the mystery gods are a potential inspiration for Christianity. And I can count the number of skeptics on one hand. I can count them on one hand out of 1,200 scholars. It's a real minority view.
Not entirely. I would still say that that it was a common idea of a dying and rising God was around before Jesus.
Well, that's not what Dr. Habermas said.
We would have to agree to disagree on that.
One of the two of you isn't right.
The point is, Tim, if you're gonna hold to a dying and rising God before Jesus, I want to say, where's the evidence?
Well, I would say that, first of all, that the myth of Dionysus probably does antedate Jesus. And yes, there isn't specifically resurrection, specifically, crucifixion, but I don't see that that's really that important a point. They all undergo a horrible, excruciating death.
You're going to have to give me a date for the earliest inscription, because Dionysus, I don't know anybody who thinks Dionysus is pre-Christian, not the resurrection portion.
Okay, well, all I can tell you is that the myth is that he is torn apart by the Titans, eaten, and he is raised from the dead.
But what is the date?
I don't know the date of the, as I said, of the original as far as any writings we have. But I
But
know
you
that with the myths, the Greek myths, most of our Greek myths we do have from later collections, except we know they were told earlier because we have the vase paintings depicting them going way back in time.
But the question is there a resurrection? And since we don't have any resurrection predating the 2nd century all the way to the 4th century, are the earliest ones, 2nd to 4th, we can say, well, maybe there's a resurrection there, but there's no data. There's absolutely no evidence for that position.
Gary, what do you see as being the affirmative case for the resurrection?
Well, Lee, let me state it this way. I do not assume that the Bible's inspired or even that the Bible is reliable as a text. I think we can get to those conclusions. But I like to take the data that critical scholars allow, even non-Christian critical scholars allow, and just say, look, I think we've got a good start in a case for the resurrection. Well, virtually all skeptics, makes no difference if you're a believer or an unbeliever, they put 1 Corinthians, a book that Tim accepts and says is reliable. They put Paul's Creed, this early statement that Tim summarizes on page 427. Paul says, I gave you, listeners from Corinth, I gave you the text, the story of the gospel, which I received. Now, he's writing this in 55 A.D.
And the crucifixion was when?
The crucifixion, give or take a year or two, is about 30 A.D. That's a nice round year. Critics are willing to say that Paul probably got this material about 35 A.D., but Peter and John and James had it before Paul did, and so we're right on top of the events. Gerald O'Collins, a moderate Roman Catholic scholar, says that this material goes back to 30 A.D., and from this we get a very early account, 30-ish, right on top of the events. We get eyewitnesses. Paul at least is an eyewitness. Then we get Paul, the eyewitness, telling us that James, Peter, and John agree. And then thirdly, we have what I might call, if I want to keep up with the E's here, enthusiasm. Their lives are transformed by their belief that they saw the risen Jesus. People get transformed for a lot of things, but these guys claim they saw the risen Jesus. And fourthly, a fourth E, I believe that Paul implies an empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. So we have early eyewitnesses who are enthusiastic and willing to die for their message that Jesus appeared to them with an empty tomb.